Discharge and discrimination. We're going to continue our discussion on this. This is one of those areas in employment law that really has a lot of focus because of the fact that everybody worries about discrimination, just about every single area. And you also want to pay attention as to how exactly discharge works, because a lot of lawsuits derive from that, and they can be expensive for both sides. So discharge and discrimination, and when you look at the aspect of what is the topic and where do we go from there, the BFOQ, as you recall, Bona-Fide Occupational Qualification Test, there's two different requirements for it. Sometimes you may have a job and they're not all that common, but at the essence you're looking as to, does the job require the employee be one sex only? So you want to look at that aspect of it too. Okay, if yes, is the requirement reasonable and necessary to the essence of the business? Let's look on the aspect of airline business travel. Do you have to be female to sit down and be an airline steward? Well, the answer is no, except for the fact that we had it for years that this was the qualification. It almost seemed like that. And now you have both male and female stewards on a plane, and we changed the name from a stewardess to steward. So it was not a BFOQ, but to be in a Playboy Club, the purpose of that is it really is more about heterosexual male fantasy than anything else. The food probably isn't all that good. Hooters, they serve chicken wings. They're not, by the way, they call, after all, the slang term is called breastaurants, to the point that the publisher actually included that in here. And it really is about the actual study of the female anatomy as much as it is about the food. So you have that. So that in the Hooters restaurant, yes, being female is part of the right to do that. And I'm certain they make quite a bit of money in the process to sit down and be in that restaurant realm, because it is unique and it is really about the showing of the female figure as much as it is about the food in the process as well. So pay attention to that aspect of it. And disparate impact screening devices, there's a couple areas that we have to sit down and pay attention to. Credit status. Is there an issue about gender race? Because sometimes there is. And what would be the aspect of credit status in a regular job? Well, some jobs, if you're dealing with finances, if you have a really low credit rating, that could be a bona fide occupational qualification. But if it's an administrative assistant, if it's a matter of a welder, I'm not certain what credit status would ever have to do with those type of jobs. It better be a real aspect to the job, and if it's not, it shouldn't be a qualification. Unwed pregnancy. Well, I'm not certain. Tell me exactly what requirements are for being married to be pregnant. Okay, so that would be one of those things if you can't really show that. Okay, they have a disparate impact. Height and weight requirements. Well, if you're going to be playing basketball in the NBA, I'll bet that my height, all of 5'6", probably wouldn't necessarily be a qualification if I can actually jump 4 feet straight up in the air and dunk the ball. I can't though. So technically, it's not a height requirement. It's just a matter of skill requirement. And you might think that I probably don't have skills in professional basketball. You would be absolutely correct. Yes, marital status. There's no area that you could possibly imagine that marital status would have anything to do on a job at all. So it's not a BFOQ. Arrest record. Education. Now, sometimes education is a requirement for a job. To be a college professor by state law, you have to have a master's degree, but you can also get by with an equivalent with some skill sets depending upon how many years you have in that industry as well. So even though you might have a college professor, they might have a master's or a doctorate, that may not necessarily be a criteria for a job, provided that you might have some qualifications that are experience related versus educational. Conviction of a crime unrelated to job performance. That could be a racial issue. It could also be one versus criminal issues. Sometimes if it's a matter of if it's in this area over here, I did this, long as you're not touching that area, you better make certain if you have your criminal record that you're considering that. Make certain that you know why you're considering it in case anybody ever files suit. You want to really, if you can, a disparate impact, you might have what we call a facially neutral policy. On the face, it applies like it covers all employees, regardless of status, but sometimes, like the story I had about the telephone screening out Asian candidates, okay, that was a inadvertent screening device that excluded an entire race. You have to pay attention because this is your turf. Make certain you know what you're doing on that. Keep in mind that a screening device of a test is sometimes flat out discriminatory. Griggs versus Duke Power, okay, the case of Griggs versus Duke Power, and this should be in your notes, we'll talk about it in more detail, but the reality of it is Duke Power Company used an IQ test to screen out candidates for somebody that high intelligence wasn't necessary. Griggs sued and won, and that is now a landmark case. That test was not germane to the topic at all. A lot of personality testing, quite frankly, I hope there's multiple lawsuits on it because now we're diving into this automatic testing of everybody, and this personality test can do this job. Okay, I have been a chief business officer, and I would fit all the criteria to be a chief business officer, intelligence-wise, academically, and experience-wise. But I know the very best one I have ever seen in my life, he would flunk a test on that because his personality did not fit that type of matrix that you would tend to have for that kind of a job. And he would be disqualified based upon a test, a personality test. Personality tests, in my opinion, have zero place in hiring. If you come to a company that's using them, you have somebody who has no experience in human resources or employment law, because quite frankly, the aspect of Griggs versus Duke Power overrules using a personality test into actually a job test. If you're going to sit down and have something like that, you should have something that has a screening device that you use to sit down and like for instance, a spreadsheet. Have a spreadsheet for a business job and you have 4 or 5 blanks and have them figure out what belongs in those blanks. Those type of rules, we call them in-basket screening tests. Those are what you should be using, something that is germane or specifically related to the hiring process. You also have a 4/5 rule, which applies, that is used a lot for affirmative action programs. Now, the 4/5 rules means about 80% of the majority of the group, they're under a screening device. You have that aspect. It's also used as a discriminatory aspect for affirmative action programs as well. If the requirement's not met, okay, you have to really sit down. You can have a test that can screen out, and if 80% of them would pass that, it'd be germane to the test. It might be appropriate to use that as well. But always have a legitimate business necessity in the process as well. Some troublesome areas, okay, you might want to have some objective quantification, scores for screening tender supplies, pre-employment interviews. If you have inconsistent questions, you need to sit down and have the same question asked for each and every single candidate. The question should be germane to the job. Questions such as do you ever plan on getting married? How many children do you plan on having? Well, what does that have to do with the job of being an accountant or being an assistant or being a welder or being a mechanic or being anything? Okay, so sometimes you have to make certain that your questions that you're asking are germane. Quite frankly, the question of if you could be any kind of an animal, what kind of an animal would you be? I have to tell you, whoever invented questions like that, I'm concerned about their mental health. No, that question should never be asked. That is one of the most foolish ones that's out there. Unfortunately, some people do ask those kind of questions. And quite frankly, I hope that all the cheetahs in the world and all the sharks in the world file a lawsuit on a class action basis and sue them. No, sharks are not necessarily bad. Well, actually, I think they're pretty bad. They got really big teeth. Okay, but the reality of asking ridiculous questions like that, there's no intelligence behind it as to what they hope to get out of it. There's no testing done, and they're open and ripe for lawsuits. So, pre-employment interviews. The small talk issue could be a problem. Make certain that you're really careful about the small talk, because that small talk, did you know that they were in this protest over here? Did you know that? Okay, you're better off making certain you have a list of the questions pre-approved by somebody not part of the committee, hopefully by human resources, and that you avoid the small talk stuff because the questions should be germane or specific to it. The applications. Okay, don't ask for maiden names. Don't ask for things you don't need, because all that does is open you up from a sloppy hiring process to be sued. Business necessity, make certain that you have a specific reason for asking everything about the aspect of the job. Don't sit down and say, I need you to pick up this box of 20-pound paper and actually move it over here to the copy machine, unless that's part of the job. And by the way, if it is part of the job, if you're working in an office and part of the job is to keep the copy machine filled with paper, and that means picking up a box, you have every single right as a bona fide occupational qualification to have a box there and have a test for everybody saying, we're going to have to pick up this box and move it over here, which is part of the job. That would be germane to the job. So you can have the test. Just make certain you can point that we do this on a regular basis for this job, and you can defend it in a court of law in front of a jury, because that could be where you end up if you don't do a good job in deciding what that is. Here's two cases I want to have in your notes. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation versus Green. Green was laid off, and Green filed a action against McDonnell Douglas because of the fact he felt that they laid off primarily African American men in the process. So he did some activities. McDonnell Douglas then, when they reposted the job that Green had occupied before, he applied for the job, but they wouldn't rehire him. By the time it was all done, this went to the Supreme Court, and they came out with the different aspects of disparate treatment. And there's 3 tests in there. It is all listed in your book. Check it out on the internet. That helps an awful lot too. But really, they couldn't find a legitimate non-discriminatory reason or a BFOQ not to hire him. They hired him because of the fact they felt that he was involved with an activity of chaining Dorsett and locking people in the building, and there was no evidence to show that he actually was participating in that. And yes, he protested, but there's no evidence he broke any laws in the process. And actually, McDonnell Douglas lost the case, and that's why we have now the McDonnell Douglas disparate treatment rules. Griggs versus Duke Power, they had a test that was not germane to the job, and they went and they applied that, and Griggs sued and won the case. So Griggs versus Duke Power is the perfect example of disparate impact. One time at a college, I had a chancellor who was talking to somebody who was going to use a personality test to screen for a certain job. He thought it was germane to the job. I had to tell the chancellor, I'm sorry, this is inappropriate. I called the consultant doing that, and I told him, I says, here's how this works. You need to withdraw this. If you ever try to sell this again, and we use this as a test, I will see to it that I'm an expert witness at the trial where he charges against you for violating Griggs versus Duke Power. You cannot use this tool for testing. Nowadays, we have numerous different areas using personality tests to screen people out for certain jobs. It is flat out illegal, and they'll be held accountable by the courts eventually. That being said, don't you be that person. Other defenses. Preponderance of evidence. If you have more than 50% that shows they're doing it, you're probably doing it. Employer's bottom line comes out correctly? No. The key is equal opportunity, not numbers. So, here are the rules to know. BFOQ, Bona-Fide Occupational Qualification. The 4/5 rule, pre-employment personality test better be germane to the job. You can always have a business necessity defense. Disparate treatment, McDonnell Douglas. Disparate impact, Griggs versus Duke Power. All things to know for now for the class, and also long-term, because this may affect you if you intend to be a leader in any type of organization. Take care.